Part 4. The decision of the Americans to commit more troops and to extend the air attacks on North Vietnam entailed the obvious risk of inciting the Chinese Communists, who for many years had been giving limited and then gradually increased assistance to the North Vietnamese, to take a more active part in the war, especially as China felt its own borders threatened. The Chinese were already sending advisors to North Vietnam, and perhaps as many as 15,000 laborers were helping repair bombed roads and railways. And while most experts did not believe the Chinese would enter the war on a large scale because of their essential economic and military weaknesses, the mere prospect of such an eventuality, or even of the commitment of Chinese volunteers, was viewed with dismay, not only because it could lead to a world war of nuclear dimensions, but because, ever since the Korean War, American military leaders had been strongly opposed to the use of large numbers of American ground forces on the Asian mainland. Now, however, in 1966, this seemed to be taking place anyway, and there was the grim prospect of the war's spread to Laos and Thailand, where communist political activity and assassination of government village officials were already rising, in a manner reminiscent of what had taken place in South Vietnam in 1958. Even though the North Vietnamese, who were the basic decision-makers, showed little willingness to enter negotiations during the summer and fall of 1965 and the winter of 1966, it seemed obvious that some sort of negotiated settlement to end the protracted Vietnamese war ultimately would have to take place, although there were those who thought the fighting might simply drag on until a petering out of guerrilla attacks created a military stalemate. The climate for negotiation was created in April 1965. President Johnson delivered an important address in Baltimore in which he expressed the willingness to enter unconditional discussions as preliminary to negotiations, while making it clear that the United States would not withdraw its support of South Vietnam or enter meaningless negotiations. President Johnson expressed an eagerness to support an area-wide Southeast Asia recovery program, including the full development of the Mekong River Valley if the North Vietnamese ceased their aggression and peace was established. The reaction of Hanoi and the Viet Cong and of the Chinese to the Johnson offer and to the many subsequent overtures made by the president was blankly negative. Toward the close of January 1966, during a prolonged, purposeful Christmas and post-Christmas pause in the air attacks against the North, President Johnson initiated a dramatic worldwide diplomatic peace offensive. He sent top emissaries to 40 countries in an attempt to get some reaction to his peace offers, but the response of the Communists remained cold. By late January 1966, the fighting in South Vietnam raged anew, and the bombing of the North had been resumed. If the North Vietnamese had been hurt by the bombing so far, their determination to go on opposing the American presence in the South had apparently not been lessened, at least not yet. There was a complete negotiatory stalemate. All those concerned were willing to have peace, but each only on his specific terms. Publicly, Hanoi, the Front, and Peking, and also Moscow, which had begun to step up its aid to Hanoi and to woo the North Vietnamese away from the Chinese, joined in denouncing the American peace tenders as a hoax. Uniformly, the Communists reiterated their demand that the Americans cease bombing the North, withdraw their forces from the South in advance of any negotiations, though this demand sometimes was hedged and fuzzy, and deal directly with the National Liberation Front. This last demand, in effect, meant recognizing the Front as an independent political entity, which was something the United States and the South Vietnamese were not willing to do. At least not yet, on the grounds that it would automatically open the door to communist domination of the South. In insisting on this point, the Communists, some observers felt, were admitting the failure of their long campaign either to mount a national insurrection or to prosecute a guerrilla war in the classic Mao Zedong tradition to a successful conclusion. Others believed that the insistence simply demonstrated another traditional communist technique or tactical ploy to keep open the front door to domination, hoping the enemy would eventually accept front negotiators, while at the same time employing the backdoor military approach, both through sustained guerrilla action and a semi-conventional military campaign of attrition and mobile counteroffensive. Beyond the question of trying to start negotiations was the crucial and larger problem of what to negotiate about and how feasibly to conduct any discussions that might be begun. The specter was raised of the Korean peace talks, which had dragged on for 2 years, while 70,000 more American casualties had been sustained. Beyond the tangled questions of who would participate in any negotiations and of how and when the United States would make good on its promise to remove its troops from South Vietnam after peace is assured, however that could be gauged, were the even knottier problems of how any peace or even a truce could be policed, or how any truly free elections could be held, first in South Vietnam and ultimately in both the South and the North on the matter of reunification. These were indeed problems that might be pondered both in the light of the history of the post-war period, especially the failures of the 1954 Geneva Conference, and of the one held in Geneva in 1962 on Laos, and with a view to the dark possibilities of the future. Given the complex background, it seemed almost impossible successfully to police any kind of settlement in a manner that would preclude an ultimate attempt by the Communists, or at least by communist-oriented neutralists, to take over all of Vietnam, nor did the outlook for Laos and Cambodia, and eventually for Thailand and Burma, look much better. Too much time had been lost, and the possibilities of creating and sustaining viable nationalist states able to stand on their own feet and resist the impact of communism, either locally inspired or deriving inspiration from communist China, no longer seemed very promising. The best that one might hope for, perhaps, was an eventual settlement of differences between China and the United States. This, in turn, might restrain a new generation of Chinese leaders from imperialist adventures in Southeast Asia. Should that happen, the nations of that region, including a reunified Vietnam, might in time form themselves into a truly neutral and unaligned bloc, which by 1966 had become one of the more realistic American objectives. Such a prognosis, however, was a long-term one, and in the difficult spring of 1966 it was hard to be sanguine about it. Since 1945, the role of the United States in Vietnam and in all of Southeast Asia has not, in the author's opinion, been one on which we can pride ourselves. The chance to guide the Asian Revolution along legitimate nationalist lines surely existed after the end of the Second World War. Our failure to take advantage of it was basically due to ignorance and to our anxiety to disentangle ourselves from situations we did not then regard as vital to our interests. To be sure, we did become embroiled in China, which we had historically considered a vital Asian area of interest, and in 1946 we made an effort to create a coalition government between the Communists and the Nationalists, an attempt that the author, who was in China at the time, felt was essentially futile, but one that might have effectively provided time to develop and support bona fide nationalist movements in Southeast Asia if, again, we had seized the opportunity. Surely one way not to encourage the growth of an anti-communist nationalist movement in Indochina was to support an outworn and despised French colonial regime. This is not to say that the United States could or should have directly involved itself in revolutionary movements in Indochina or elsewhere in Southeast Asia and made them turn out the way we wanted in American terms. This was as impossible as it was undesirable, but there were many things we might have done. For instance, to help some of the nationalist leaders in what is now the two halves of Vietnam establish sincere dialogues with the French and reach the sort of independent solutions many of them were groping for. Had we done so, had we at least tried with imagination and foresight, we might have helped immeasurably to avoid the 2 decades of bloodshed, civil war, and disillusion that have followed, and our own prestige in Asia might have been much higher than it is today. It is because of the many Western failures of omission and commission, failures that do not exonerate those of the anti-communist Vietnamese and other native nationalist leaders, which were and still are many, that I have entitled this book, The Lost Revolution. The principal losers, of course, have been the Vietnamese people, some 30 million of them, more or less equally divided between North and South Vietnam. If one includes the period of the Pacific War, during which they were an ostensible part of the Japanese co-prosperity sphere, the Vietnamese have now been involved in war as of 1966, with all its terrible economic, social, cultural, and psychological consequences, for 25 years. The Vietnamese are, in many respects, the most sophisticated and courageous people in Southeast Asia, and the fact that they were never given the opportunity to create a unified nation with the promise of playing a meaningful role in the world community stands today as one of the great post-war democratic failures. In this sense, the lost revolution is as much an American loss as a French one, and the irony therein is obvious. For the United States and France were the two modern nations whose revolutions served to inspire millions of people throughout the world, including the Vietnamese, offering them an alternative to communist moves to subvert their longing for freedom. Saigon, January 1966, Robert Shaplen. Revised edition published by Harper Colophon Books in 1966. Please like and subscribe if you'd like me to continue reading this book. I would be happy to. Just give me a note in the comments.